The ruling class. Elementi di Scienza Politica. Gaetano Mosca. Translation by Hannah D. Kahn. Edited and revised, with an introduction, by Arthur Livingston. 1896. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Chapter 5. Juridical Defense. 1. We might very well dispense with defining the moral sense. It is something that we all feel and understand without a definite, carefully qualified formula to describe it. Generally, however, the phrase is taken to mean that mass of sentiments by which the natural propensity of human beings to develop their activities and capacities, to satisfy their appetites and impulses, to command and enjoy, is curbed by a natural compassion for the pain or harm that other people may experience from an indulgence of that propensity. Sometimes such sentiments are carried to a point where the spiritual satisfaction one derives from procuring pleasure or advantage for another is greater than the material satisfaction one derives from providing for one's own pleasure. When our limiting the satisfaction of our impulses at the cost of another's sacrifice rests on sentiments of affection for people who are close and dear to us, it is said to be based on sympathy. When it is inspired solely by the respect that is due to other men, even strangers or enemies, simply because they are men, we get a sentiment that is far more delicate and not so generally felt by people, the sentiment of justice. Idealizations and exaggerations of these moral sentiments are crystallized in the well-known formulas, love thy neighbor as thyself. Do unto others as you would that they should do unto you. These maxims, however, express an aspiration to a moral perfection that can never be attained rather than a practical counsel that is applicable in real life. Save for exceptions that arise almost exclusively in connection with parental love, each individual is better qualified than anyone else to look out for himself, and if he is to look out for himself effectively he must love himself a little more than he loves others and deal with them otherwise than he deals with himself. One might well feel that all these cautions on our part were hardly required, for the fact is that, apart from some exceptional moment or some exceptional individual, people have never taken the maxims mentioned seriously. The question as to whether the moral sense is progressive or stationary has been much debated. As is well known, Buckle, a distinguished English writer of the past century, observed that the purest and loftiest ethical principles had been known and proclaimed in remotely ancient times, and he therefore maintained that progress in human societies is almost exclusively intellectual and scientific, never moral. The much-followed evolutionist school of our day reaches essentially different conclusions. According to the evolutionists, the moral sense can, and must, continually progress in view of the struggle for existence, which selects for survival in every society the individuals who are richest in altruistic sentiments, these being the sentiments that best serve the interests of the social body. In the struggle for existence between different societies, victory regularly goes to societies in which the same altruistic sentiments are, on the average, strongest. We had better examine these two doctrines briefly, just to show that neither of them can be taken as a basis for scientific conclusions. Suppose we begin with the second, which has so far won wider acceptance. 2. We have already proved to our own satisfaction, Chapter 1, Section 13, that, in a society that has attained any degree of civilization at all, the struggle between individuals is not a struggle for existence but a struggle for preeminence. But even ignoring that, we find altogether paradoxical the principle that is proclaimed by these self-styled positivists, to the effect that within every social group those individuals who are most moral and therefore most highly endowed with altruistic sentiments are the ones who are destined to survive, in our terms, to attain the highest social rankings. All that we can grant in that regard, and we grant it very willingly, is that an individual who is particularly deficient in moral sense, and is unable to conceal his propensities sufficiently, will have to overcome greater difficulties than others because of the antipathy and repugnance that he will generally inspire. But as far as that goes, an individual who has an unusually delicate moral sense will be at a disadvantage that is almost as serious. In all the dealings, great or small, of life, he will find himself fighting with altogether inferior weapons. Most men will use against him tricks that he will be thoroughly familiar with but will be careful not to use, and he will certainly suffer far greater damage from that fact than the sly rascal who knows just where to stop in his crookedness will ever suffer from the ill will that he arouses about him. Really, one may be good almost unconsciously through a natural simplicity of character, or one may be consciously good through magnanimity of purpose, high resolve, unconquerable aversion to evil, inflexible integrity of character, but certainly one could never become good from believing that by being good one could more easily realize one's aims, or achieve what is commonly called success in life. Utilitarianism interpreted in that sense, as the basis of morality, could only be, to speak quite plainly, the maneuver of a hypocrite or the dream of a fool. It follows that, in all societies, so-called evolution, the selection of the best, ought to eventuate in a perpetuation and multiplication of individuals of average morality, who are, in literal fact, the best adapted to what is called the struggle for existence. Survival, or, as we consider it more accurate to say, preeminence, ought preferably to await those characters who, in whatever sort of social environment, represent a moral mean of the most highly refined gold. And yet the evolutionary theory does not seem to become acceptable even with that basic emendation, since it assumes in any event that the moral element is always the main factor in the success or failure of an individual in achieving the aims that he sets out to achieve in life. In practice, things do not work out that way at all. To say nothing of the influence of chance, which is far greater than is commonly supposed, the possession in greater or lesser degree of certain intellectual qualities, such as readiness of perception and keenness of observation, figures vary considerably in the decision as to whether a man is to reach the higher ranks in his society or is to stay in the lower. But there is the very great influence also of other qualities, which depend upon the individual's temperament, without being, strictly speaking, either intellectual or moral, such qualities as tenacity of purpose, self-confidence and, above all, activity. If we set out to judge whether an individual will or will not get on in life, whatever the type of society, we find that we cannot use any single criterion, to be sure, but that if we would keep an eye on the main factor, we must watch and see whether he is active, and whether he knows how to make good use of his activity. Apart from brief periods of violent revolution, personal qualities are always less important, as regards attaining the highest positions in life, than birth or family. In any type of society, whether ostensibly democratic or otherwise, being born to a high station is one of the best claims a person can have to staying there. Families that have occupied the highest levels in the social scale for a number of generations often lack the qualities that are best fitted to carry a man from the bottom to the top, while they possess very different qualities in abundance. Except in unusual cases that are due to careful education, old aristocratic families are not distinguished for activity. At the same time, a real refinement of the moral sense may be detected in persons who have not had to fight fierce, shady, and often degrading battles in order to reach the top. In a word, the virtues and defects that help a plebeian to force the gates of an aristocracy are something very different from the virtues and defects of aristocrats themselves. We can accept as true only one portion of the selectionist theory. One may safely grant that, other things being equal, in a struggle between two societies, that society will triumph in which the individual members are on the average better equipped in moral sense and therefore more united, more trustful of each other and more capable of self-sacrifice. But that exception hurts the evolutionary thesis as a whole more than it helps it. If, in a given society, a higher average of moral sense cannot be explained by any survival of the best individuals, then, granting that the higher average is there, it can be ascribed only to the better organization of the society, to causes, in other words, that are historical in nature and that are the worst enemies of those who try to explain social phenomena primarily by changes in the individual organism or in the individual psyche. 3. Though Buckle's theories are not as widely at variance with our point of view as the above, we feel unable to accept them without modifying or at least supplementing them to some extent. It is of course true that in very ancient societies we find maxims and laws that denote an exquisite moral sense. In the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, for instance, especially in parts of it that go back to a very remote antiquity, precepts very similar to the Ten Commandments are to be found, and papyri dating from the 12th dynasty contain moral principles that are as good as anything in Christian or Buddhist ethics. The Platonists and the Stoics in the Greco-Roman world and the Essenes in the Hebrew world represented very high levels of morality, and numerous traces of the same ethics can easily be noted in Chinese, Indian and Persian civilizations long anterior to the Christian era. But though the precepts in question go back to very remote times, they were formulated and accepted by peoples who in very ancient civilizations, and whose moral sense, therefore, had undergone a long protracted elaboration. Indeed, if any comparison is possible between the morality of a primitive tribe and the ethical system of a relatively civilized people that has been organized for long ages in great and populous political organisms, it is the comparison that can be made between the ethical systems of a child and an adult. The former is unconscious, the latter conscious. In the former, good and bad impulses are roughly sketched. In the latter we find them fully developed and mature. Child and savage alike may do evil, and great evil, but in what they do blind animal impulse will always figure more largely than calculation and premeditation, and they may even do good without ever achieving that exquisite discrimination, that deliberate sacrifice of self, of which the adult human being and the civilized human being are capable. Making due allowances, of course, ethical feeling in the crude person stands to ethical feeling in the well-bred person much as the sense of morality in the child or the savage stands to the ethical system of the adult or the civilized man. What we call delicacy of feeling is just the intuition of a higher morality applied to a greater number of social relationships. European travelers in the interior of Africa have, in general, found the Arab adventurers who foregather there preferable to the native Negroes. That is understandable. The Arabs are heirs to an ancient civilization. Though they are perfectly capable of treachery, theft and murder, they can, when they choose, assume the manners of gentlemen. They have some conception at least of a morality that is higher, and so more like our own. But it is not only in greater refinement of moral and immoral impulses that civilized man differs from the savage. In societies of ancient culture that have for centuries enjoyed sound political organizations, the repression of immoral impulses, what some criminologists call the inhibition that curbs impulses, is unquestionably stronger and acquires all the force of inveterate habit. By a long and slow process of elaboration, such societies gradually develop the institutions that enable a universal morality to curb the expression of individual immorality in a certain number of public and private relationships. When they are not under the sway of interests and passions, almost all individuals come to understand that a given act is not consistent with the sentiments of justice that prevail in the society in which they live. Still, the greater majority of individuals might commit that very act under stress of passion or at the bidding of an engrossing interest. Now public opinion, religion, law, and the whole social mechanism that enforces observance of the law, are expressions of the mass conscience, which in the general case is dispassionate and disinterested as against the one, or the few, whose perception of what is just and honest is clouded at the given moment by the violence of selfish impulses. The judge is the instrument of the mass moral sense, which, case by case, curbs the passions and evil instincts of the individual and holds them in leash. So in a highly developed civilization, not only do moral instincts and for that matter selfish passions, become more refined, more conscious, more perfect. In a society in which political organization has made great progress, moral discipline is itself unquestionably greater, and the two selfish acts that are inhibited, or obstructed, by the reciprocal surveillance and restraint of the individuals who compose the society are more numerous and more clearly defined. In every society, of course, there is a relatively small number of individuals who have tendencies that are definitely refractory to any sort of social discipline and, likewise, a certain number of individuals of superior scruples and soundly molded characters for whom any curb from without would be superfluous. But between these two extremes come the vast majority of men, who have average consciences, for whom fear of harm or punishment, and the fact that they are to be held responsible for their conduct by other people who are neither their accomplices nor their subordinates, serve as most effective means for overcoming the thousand temptations to transgress the moral law that everyday living offers. The social mechanisms that regulate this disciplining of the moral sense constitute what we call juridical defense, respect for law, government by law. These mechanisms are not equally perfect in all societies. It may happen that a society that has advanced further than some other in the arts and sciences remains conspicuously inferior to that other in this respect. And it may also happen that juridical defense weakens and becomes less efficient in societies that are traversing periods of scientific and economic progress. Great catastrophes, such as long wars or great revolutions, everywhere produce periods of social dissolution, when the disciplining of selfish impulses falters, when habits that have long curbed them break, and when brutish instincts that have been dulled but not eradicated by long periods of peace and civilized living come to life again, for if greater culture has succeeded in veiling them, it has also steeled and sharpened them. So from time to time we see groups of adventurers from civilized countries, on coming into contact with barbarous peoples or peoples of a social type markedly different from theirs, feeling themselves loosed from ordinary moral restraints and perpetrating the sort of crimes that won infamy for the Spanish conquerors in America, and for Hastings and Clive in India. The tremendous successes of the 30 Years' War, or of the French Revolution and other civil wars, become explainable by reference to these same criteria. Characteristic is the picture that Thucydides paints of the demoralization that fell upon Greece after the struggles between different cities, and the civil wars within individual cities, which took place during the Peloponnesian War. It is interesting to note that all social cataclysms that destroy moral discipline are followed by periods of relaxation in that discipline itself, so that the level of morals is re-established but very gradually. Letourneau has well shown that intellectual progress is much more rapid among barbarians and savages than moral progress. This phenomenon is apparent in civilized societies as they emerge from periods of social disorganization. It is due to the fact that moral habits are established and re-established very slowly, but it contributes to lending a semblance of truth to Buckle's doctrine, that the moral sense is absolutely stationary. We have so far carefully avoided, it will be noted, any speculation as to the origins of the moral or altruistic instincts. For our purposes here, it is sufficient to observe that they are innate in man and necessary to social living. It will further be noted that our view is contrary to the doctrine of Rousseau, that man is good by nature but that society makes him wicked and perverse. We believe that social organization provides for the reciprocal restraint of human individuals by one another and so makes them better, not by destroying their wicked instincts, but by accustoming them to controlling their wicked instincts. 4. The chief peoples that have had histories, or are now making them, entrust the disciplining of the moral sense not to religion only but to the whole legislative system. In the early periods of all peoples the secular enactment and the religious precept go absolutely hand in hand, and the sanctions that uphold the one uphold the other also. That is the case even today in some societies. But in our time, in countries of European and Chinese civilization, secular or civil organization and religious organization are more or less distinctly separated, the religious organization becoming more effective according to the strength of the faith that it manages to inspire and maintain, whereas the secular organization bases its progress on its success in conforming to certain psychological tendencies. It has long been debated whether the religious sanction, when taken apart from the political sanction, is more effective than the latter, whether, in other words, fear of hell is worth more in actual practice than fear of jail and the policeman. A definite answer, applicable to all the cases that might arise under the question, can hardly be given. Evidently a country in which political organization is slack and primitive while religious faith is ardent is in an essentially different situation from another country in which religious enthusiasms have deteriorated while political, administrative and judiciary systems have improved. Both religious precepts and secular laws emanate from the collective moral sense that is indispensable to all human associations, and it is undeniable that all religions do have, as they could hardly fail to have, some practical influence. But there is reason to fear, nevertheless, that the importance of religion can easily be overestimated. If religion were so important, it would seem, for instance, that the moral difference between a Christian people and an idolatrous people should be very considerable. Now of course if we compare a civilized Christian people with a barbarous, idolatrous people, the moral discrepancy is enormous, but if we place side by side two peoples of the same degree of barbarism, one of which has embraced Christianity, and the other not, it will be found that in practice their behaviors are very much the same, or at least there is no appreciable difference between them. The modern Abyssinians are a living and notorious illustration of this fact. Cardinal Mosca was a missionary in Ethiopia for 35 years. He testifies to the scant practical influence of Christianity on the lives of the Abyssinians. If we compare the still pagan but politically well-organized society of the age of Marcus Aurelius with the Christian but very disorderly society that is described by Gregory of Tours, we very much suspect that the parallel would prove to be favorable to the former. It is consistent with human nature that certain and speedy punishment, however slight relatively, should be generally more feared than a far severer punishment that is uncertain and remote. For average consciences, at the moment when greed, lust or vengefulness spurs them to theft, rape or murder, fear of prison and the gallows is a more potent and, especially, a more certain deterrent than the possibility of eternal torment. If that is true for great breaches of the moral law, which are committed only in moments of violent passion, it is truer still of those petty violations of the more obvious precepts of fairness and justice into which human beings are misled by the daily pressures of petty interests and little jealousies. Is there a moral or religious law that does not recognize that to pay one's debts is, on the whole, a just and proper thing? Yet one has to confess that many good believers would fail to pay theirs, and would find 1,000 sophistries and pretenses to uphold their own consciences in doing so, if they were not held to their obligations by public disgrace and, above all, by the process server. It takes no over-delicate conscience to understand that to pummel and beat another person is, at the very best, not a decorous thing to do, yet the habit of laying hands on one's neighbor in the moment of anger is effectively combated in the masses only by the certainty that the man who deals a blow runs the chance of promptly receiving another in return and that the business may easily go farther than that. As the weakest and most defenseless of human beings, women and children should be the ones most entitled to protection from the religious and moral sentiments, but we see only too regularly, alas, that in actual fact they are the most frequent victims of brutal physical assaults. In very religious countries, where the lower classes are completely at the mercy of the higher, it is no unusual thing to see masters beating their servants or other subordinates. Religious faith, like patriotic enthusiasms and political passions, may at moments of extraordinary exhilaration produce great currents of abnegation and self-sacrifice and spur the masses to acts and efforts which, to one considering man's ordinary nature only, seem almost superhuman. Catholic jubilees and Protestant revivals furnish more than one example, And one might mention as characteristic the great wave of charity and brotherly love that swept over Umbria in the day of St. Francis of Assisi and a number of fleeting moments in the French Revolution and during the disturbances of '48 in Italy. We are speaking here of collective, not individual, acts. As regards the latter, cases where isolated individuals, or groups of individuals, give proof of extraordinary abnegation and complete self-sacrifice are not so very rare in any age, or in any civilized nation. They come to the fore in every war and in every serious epidemic, on any occasion, in short, when it is desirable and necessary that someone suffer or face a danger in the interest of all. On such occasions, just as a sublimation of virtue is to be seen in some individuals, so an exaggerated cowardice and selfishness appears in others, who cast aside the mask they have been accustomed to wear the moment they are faced by a real danger and a real need of self-sacrifice. It is equally true, of course, that just as the masses have occasional spasms of exalted abnegation and self-sacrifice, so they have feverish paroxysms of the base emotions, greed, lust for blood, panic. But the capacity that certain sentiments have for exciting ephemeral periods of intoxication should not mislead one as to their actual efficacy in the ordinary daily lives of human beings. In moments of patriotic and religious exhilaration, whole cities have been known to despoil themselves of their property in order to donate it to state or church. But no political organization can long subsist unless taxation has its compulsory aspect, and the Catholic Church itself, whenever it has been able, has made the tithes obligatory. The patriotic, and still more the religious sentiment, and most of all the two combined in a single passion, suffice to produce general and violent insurrections, and at times they have prompted whole populations to take up arms and set out upon distant and very perilous expeditions. This was the case in the first 2 or 3 crusades. But save in peoples who look upon war as an ordinary occupation and a normal source of gain, those two sentiments do not provide an adequate basis for sound and dependable armies that will be ready at a moment's notice wherever they are needed. Among people who normally depend upon agriculture, industry and commerce, armies of that sort are products of a sound social discipline, which inexorably forces the individual to do his duty and lend his services at certain times and in specified ways. 5. The political organization proper, the organization that establishes the character of the relations between the governing class and the governed and between the various levels and various sections of the ruling class, is the factor that contributes more than any other to determining the degree of perfection that juridical defense, or government by law, can attain in a given people. The existence of an honest government, a government that is based on integrity and justice, a government that is truly liberal in Guicciardini's sense of the term, is the best guarantee that one can have that the rights commonly known as private will be effectively upheld, in other words, that property will be protected. Guicciardini defines political liberty as a prevalence of law and public decrees over the appetites of particular men. If we take particular men in the sense of individuals, meaning single individuals, including individuals who have power in their hands, it would be difficult to find a more rigorously scientific definition. It has, too, the virtue of being very ancient, since, unwittingly perhaps, Guicciardini was repeating the substance of an apothegm of one of the famous 7 wise men of Greece. Guicciardini was certainly not an ingenuous soul. In his Pensieri and Discorsi he often reverts to the opinion that men in general love the good and the just whenever love of their own interest and the interests of relatives, or fear of the vengeance of others, does not mislead their understanding. These words contain a recognition of the psychological law that we have put forward as the basis of juridical defense. A corrupt government, in which the person who commands makes his will licit in his law whether in the name of God or in the name of the people does not matter, will obviously be inadequate to fulfilling its mission in regard to juridical defense. Officially it may proclaim acceptable and even lofty principles in regard to legal process. In practice the principles will not be very strictly observed. In the Old Kingdom of Naples and to an extent in Tsarist Russia, law enforcement by the courts, and the law itself, could be nullified by a police official. Even equality before the law, though officially proclaimed, was more or less a farce. To choose an ancient example, as less stirring to modern emotions, the Theodosian Code lays down that the larger property owners, potentiates possessors, should pay their taxes through provincial governors, because, it seems, the municipal magistrates, who were generally entrusted with the collection of taxes, were too weak as compared with the landowners and too deferential towards them. Under Arcadius, farmers who were freemen had a right, in the abstract, to hail a proprietor before the imperial courts, but such a procedure was styled an impertinence, audacium. The extent to which relations between rulers and ruled, and between the various cliques among rulers, are inspired by principles of morality and justice, varies, of course, more or less appreciably according to the country and the period in history. Readily apparent is the difference in this respect between the government, say, of the Chinese mandarins and the government of the Turkish pashas and viziers of the good old days, men of the stamp of Muhammad Kuprilu, Mustafa Baraktar, or Ali Felon, who disposed offhand of questions touching the property, persons, and lives of the reyes, and sometimes of believers. Whatever their good intentions, the Chinese mandarins were obliged to follow the lead of bureaucratic corruption in order to supplement their meager stipends somewhat, and they had to refer capital sentences to Peking for review and on occasion reversal, unless a province were subject to emergency laws. Under Ivan the Terrible, when mass confiscations of property, mass exterminations of whole city populations, were ordinary occurrences in Russia, that country was ruled very differently from the way it was under the last Tsars, and the Tsarist Russia of the 19th century was, in turn, governed very differently from England, where every arrest of an individual has to be legalized in earnest and very promptly. The great nations of Central and Western Europe have been ruled very differently from the republics of South America. In Latin America it is still customary for the leaders of the winning party to shoot the leaders of the beaten party, and, not so very long ago, it was easier to compute the thefts committed by those who held power for any length of time in hundreds of millions than in millions. Some writers have no difficulty in explaining these variations in the degree of excellence of political systems on the basis of racial differences. But racial defects can hardly be appealed to in such cases. Peoples who seem backward today may at one period or another in their history have managed to create very advanced types of civilization, and have had political organizations in which respect for law, or juridical defense, was relatively excellent as compared with the situation prevailing at those times in nations which today surpass them in that regard. Even today such peoples do not show in private relations the organic inferiority in the moral sense that seems to be manifest in their public affairs. The Spaniards and the Sicilians are commonly regarded as peoples of low-grade political morality. No one would claim that they are morally inferior to other Europeans in their family relations, or in their personal dealings and friendships. Others explain the variations in question by differences in level of civilization, and in that they are in a measure right. As we shall see hereafter, it is very difficult, if not impossible, for populous wide-spreading social units, such as the modern nations, to perfect juridical defense to any high degree unless they have attained fairly high levels of intellectual and economic development. But to be partially right is not to be wholly right. Many peoples have had periods of material and intellectual splendor and yet, as it were by a sort of fatal curse, have never been able to rid themselves of certain types of political organization that seem to be utterly unsuited to ensuring any real progress in the morality of their governing classes. The Arabian caliphates of Baghdad, Cordoba and Cairo were leaders in world civilization for some centuries. They never achieved any appreciable progress in political organization. What is commonly called civilization, therefore, is evidently a necessary prerequisite to political progress but yet not enough to provoke or explain it. It may, indeed, be maintained that habits figure to a very large extent in determining the maximum degree of perfection or imperfection in juridical defense that a people is capable of permanently enjoying or systematically tolerating. It may be taken for granted that the modern Persians could not possibly adapt themselves in one generation, or even in many, to the system that is today in force in England, nor could the Englishmen of our day ever be brought to accept the sort of government that is provided for the subjects of the Shah. We have already noted that moral habits change far more slowly than intellectual habits, yet however slowly they do change, and both for the better and for the worse. Englishmen would not tolerate today a king like Richard III, a Lord Chancellor like Francis Bacon, a judge like Jeffreys, an army general like that John Graham of Claverhouse who commanded in Scotland, or, we may venture, a Lord Protector like Cromwell. So we might reasonably hope that a Barnabo Visconti or a Cesare Borgia would be impossible among the Italians of today. Polybius admired the political system of the Romans as the best of all the governments of his day. But within a few generations those same Romans had learned to accept the tyrannies of Tiberius, Caligula and Nero, while the descendants of the Greeks who had lived in the days of Aristides, Pericles and Epaminondas submitted over long centuries to the rule of the degenerate emperors of Byzantium. Now there must be reasons why certain habits are formed in preference to other habits. Even granting, therefore, that variety in political systems is due in the main to differences in political habits, the problem of why different habits arise still remains unsolved. In a word, we are here confronted with a great psychological law which can alone explain why the moral instincts of a people are now more, now less, embodied and developed in its political constitution. And that law is only one of many manifestations of another more general law, which we set forth earlier in this chapter, and which explains the greater or lesser efficacy of moral restraints in all phases of social life. 6. The absolute preponderance of a single political force, the predominance of any oversimplified concept in the organization of the state, the strictly logical application of any single principle in all public law are the essential elements in any type of despotism, whether it be a despotism based upon divine right or a despotism based ostensibly on popular sovereignty, for they enable anyone who is in power to exploit the advantages of a superior position more thoroughly for the benefit of his own interests and passions. When the leaders of the governing class are the exclusive interpreters of the will of God or of the will of the people and exercise sovereignty in the name of those abstractions in societies that are deeply imbued with religious beliefs or with democratic fanaticism, and when no other organized social forces exist apart from those which represent the principle on which sovereignty over the nation is based, then there can be no resistance, no effective control, to restrain a natural tendency in those who stand at the head of the social order to abuse their powers. When a governing class can permit itself anything in the name of a sovereign who can do anything, it undergoes a real moral degeneration, the degeneration that is common to all men whose acts are exempt from the restraint that the opinion and the conscience of their fellows ordinarily impose. When responsibility in subordinates and the end is one with irresponsibility and omnipotence in the man or in the little group of men standing at the head of the official hierarchy as a whole, call that man czar or sultan, or that group a committee of public safety, the vices that absolutism generates in its leaders are communicated downward to the whole political structure. Anything may be ventured when one is interpreting the will, real or imaginary, of a person who thinks he has the right to bend everything to his will, but who cannot possibly see everything and who does not have free and disinterested consciences about him to control his passions and correct his mistakes. The effects of such a system are in the highest degree deplorable, and they are swift in manifesting themselves. The Russian novelist Dostoevsky lived long in a land of autocracy and spent 10 years in exile in Siberia. He has described with greater veracity and feeling than anybody else among the moderns the degeneration of character that absolute power produces in men. We cannot forego a quotation. When a man has unlimited power over the flesh and blood of his fellow man, when a man is in a position to degrade another human being to the limits of degradation, he is unable to resist the temptation to do wrong. Tyranny is a habit. In the end it becomes a disease. The best man in the world becomes so brutalized as to be indistinguishable from a wild beast. Blood intoxicates, the spirit becomes accessible to the greatest abnormalities, and these can come to seem real joys. The possibility of such license sometimes becomes contagious in a whole people, and yet society, which despises the official hangman, does not despise the hangman who is all-powerful. Now this type of moral intoxication has been pointed to by not a few psychiatrists of our day. It explains the excesses of those who are omnipotent. It supplies the key to the criminal follies of some of the old Roman emperors, of Ivan IV and Peter the Great, of many sultans of the East, of Robespierre, Barrère, Carrier, Le Bon. As is well known, some of those individuals had shown quite normal characters before achieving supreme power. They were utterly alien to the excesses in which they afterwards indulged. The failing is particularly characteristic of individuals who are not destined to supreme power by family or birth. Napoleon remarked to Dr. O'Mara at St. Helena that no one but himself had ever done him any harm, that he had been his own worst enemy, and that schemes that were altogether his own, the expedition to Moscow and all that followed from it, had been the sole causes of his downfall. So, then, not Napoleon's genius, not even the lucid sense he had of his own best interests, was able, because of his despotic power, to keep him from making mistakes in which his own fortunes foundered and through which hundreds of thousands of human lives were lost. It may be objected that some absolute sovereigns have been good, just as others have been bad, and that in continental Europe, before the modern adoption of constitutional and parliamentary forms of government, absolutism did not produce results that were disastrous enough to justify the view that we have here put forward. The ready answer is that after the Middle Ages the absolutisms that prevailed in Europe were far from being complete, that even the authority of a Louis XIV had powerful checks in the traditions of a day when a king was just the first among his barons, in the long-standing privileges of the nobility and the provinces and especially in the more or less complete separation of church and state. In any event, human nature is so rich and so varied that we may readily admit a thing which, for that matter, history proves, namely, that there have been individuals who have managed wholly to tame their passions and to remain pure and honest even after long investiture with absolute authority. But the good that such lucky accidents have actually accomplished is not as great as is commonly supposed. In a country that is permanently accustomed to a despotic regime, the ruling class, taken as a class, usually becomes fawning and craven before superiors, and inevitably becomes haughty, despotic and overbearing toward inferiors. Men, unhappily, are so made that the more subject they are to the caprice and the will of the persons above them, the more likely they are to force their caprice and will upon those who are below them and in their power. Anyone can find examples in the private and even the family life he sees about him to corroborate the rule which we have here formulated. In the modern state, which is spread over a vast territory and has extremely complicated bureaucratic and administrative systems, the head of the state has a very slight influence upon the ordinary life of the people, apart from a number of important decisions, such as choice between war and peace. Often, therefore, abuses will exist to which the sovereigns are personally most averse. Alexander I, Nicholas I and Alexander II of Russia were certainly very much opposed to administrative corruption, and so was Ferdinand II of Naples. Yet the practice of bribing officials persisted to the end in Tsarist Russia, and was never eradicated in the Kingdom of Naples. History shows a number of cases where the establishment of despotic government has been advantageous to peoples, at least temporarily. Cesare Borgia is said to have given Romagna a chance to catch a free breath by destroying the bandits and petty tyrants that infested that region. Muhammad Ali gave Egypt a little peace by exterminating the Mamelukes. All that such examples show is that despotism, though the worst of all political systems, is nevertheless preferable to anarchy, the absence of any government at all. 7. Aristotle, Polybius and a number of other writers of ancient times expressed a preference for mixed forms of government, forms, that is, which combine traits of monarchy, aristocracy and democracy in certain proportions, so clearly intuiting the law that we have just stated. In the Greek state, the ancient monarchy, resting on its sacred character and on tradition, the aristocracy, which also represented tradition and, as a rule, ownership of land, the demos, based on money, mobile wealth, numbers, mob passions, were so many political forces, the interplay of which, so long as any one of them did not prevail to the exclusion of the others, was such as to provide a type of political organization in which due process of law was, in ordinary times, relatively secure. In Rome again, in the day when Polybius was so greatly admiring her constitution, we find the influence of great landed property in the hands of the patricians and the influence of small landed property in the hands of the plebeians tempered and balanced by the influence of money and mobile capital in the hands of the knights. We find the traditions of the great families of optimates descended from the gods holding their power in the face of popular passions and the talents and newly gotten wealth of the great plebeian families. And we find those different political forces so embodied in the various authorities, political, military, administrative and judiciary, and so allying with each other and balancing each other as to give rise to a state that was in juridical terms the most perfect of all antiquity. In the 18th century, Montesquieu studied the English constitution and derived from it the doctrine that if a country was to be free, power should curb power, the exercise of the three fundamental powers that he found present in any state being entrusted to separate political organs. Now writers on constitutional law have shown that there can be no such thing as the absolute separation of the three powers that Montesquieu conceived and that there is no reason why the powers in question should be three rather than any other number. But that, probably, is not Montesquieu's main defect, which, for that matter, comes out more prominently in the many writers who have drawn on Montesquieu than in Montesquieu himself. With their eyes fixed upon the master's theory, such imitators have been inclined to stress its formal or, so to say, legalistic aspect rather than its substantial or social aspect. They have often forgotten that if one political institution is to be an effective curb upon the activity of another, it must represent a political force, it must, that is, be the organized expression of a social influence and a social authority that has some standing in the community, as against the forces that are expressed in the political institution that is to be controlled. That is why, in certain parliamentary monarchies, in spite of the letter of constitutions and fundamental charters, we see heads of states, who are supported neither by ancient traditions nor by the all but vanishing prestige of the divine right doctrine nor by the influence of the bureaucracy, the army or the economically superior classes, becoming powerless to counterbalance the influence of elective assemblies, who are supported by a belief that they represent the totality of the citizens and actually comprise within themselves a considerable body of capacities, interests, ambitions and energies. That is why in those same countries the courts are proclaimed by word of mouth to be fundamental organs of the state, while in fact they are mere branches of a bureaucracy, depending upon a cabinet that is loyal to the majority in the elective chamber. So they come to lack prestige and independence and are never capable of mustering enough moral and intellectual energy to assert their own importance. For the same reason, finally, a number of senates and upper houses have easily been relegated to subordinate positions by lower houses that are functioning at their sides. That is because they are made up of pensioned officials, deputies and assemblymen, who have retired from militant political life, along with a few rich men whose vanities the ministries have found it expedient to flatter. Such bodies, therefore, do not offer adequate fields either for aggressive minds or for ambitious talents. They do not represent important social forces. 8. If a political organism is to progress in the direction of attaining greater and greater improvement in juridical defense, the prime and most essential requisite is that the secular and ecclesiastical powers shall be separated, or, better, that the principle on which the exercise of temporal authority is based shall have nothing sacred and immutable about it. When power rests on a system of ideas and beliefs outside of which it is felt that there can be neither truth nor justice, it is almost impossible that its acts should be debated and moderated in practice. Social progress can hardly reach a point where, in such a case, the different powers will harmonize with each other and check each other effectively enough to prevent absolute control by the individual, or individuals, who stand at the head of the social order. The relative immobility of certain social types must be ascribed to failures in the respects here suggested. The sacred character of the caste has for many centuries prevented any social progress in Hindu civilization. In its beginnings, that civilization must have had very brilliant possibilities. Otherwise there would be no way to account for the great material and artistic progress which it actually did achieve. That leads to a supposition, which seems, for that matter, to be confirmed by recent studies, that the division of the Hindu population into castes, and the isolation of the various castes, cannot always have been as thoroughgoing and extreme as we find them today. It seems that Brahmanism did not become altogether rigid, stationary and formalistic until after its victorious struggle with Buddhism in India. Mohammedan societies are afflicted with the same weakness. The fact has been remarked by many people, but it has been stressed with the greatest penetration by Leroy Bewley. The Mohammedan Tatars who dwelt in the Russian governments of Kazan, Astrakhan and the Crimea, that writer describes as prosperous, clean living and given to trade, but he adds, "The great vice of Islam, the real cause of its political inferiority, lies neither in its dogma nor even in its morality, but in its habit of confusing the spiritual with the temporal, the religious law with the secular law. The Quran is Bible and code in one, it is the word of the Prophet that takes the place of law. Ordinances and customs are therefore consecrated to eternity by religion, and because of that fact alone every Mussulman civilization is necessarily stationary." To supplement that analysis, which is both keen and exact, one might add that in countries where Mohammedan populations are independent the sovereign is almost always a caliph, or vicar of the Prophet, or at least derives his authority nominally or actually from a caliph. In view of that, no believer can deny him absolute obedience without impugning the legitimacy of the caliphate's authority and initiating a religious reform. That is why, as we saw above, Chapter 3, Section 5, civil wars and revolutions among Mohammedans have as a rule taken some religious reform as their pretext, or some claim to the vicarate of the Prophet. That was the case in the conflicts between the Omeyyads, the Abbasids and the Fatimids, which drenched the early history of Islam in blood. That was the case in the struggles that upset northern Africa and Spain in the 11th and 12th centuries, and in very recent movements that have disturbed those countries. Of course, in all such struggles, considerations of an altogether worldly character figured, along with a religious motive. Christian peoples have managed to avoid the dangerous confusion that Leroy Bewley refers to, and so, as the result of a number of favoring circumstances, they have been able to create the secular state. In the first place, the Bible luckily contains very few maxims that can be directly applied to political life. In the second place, though the Catholic Church has always aspired to a preponderant share in political power, it has never been able to monopolize it entirely, because of two traits, chiefly, that are basic in its structure. Celibacy has generally been required of the clergy and of monks. Therefore no real dynasties of abbots and bishops have ever been able to establish themselves. On this score the Western world owes Gregory VII a great debt of gratitude. Secondly, in spite of numerous examples to the contrary supplied by the warlike Middle Ages, the ecclesiastical calling has by its very nature never been strictly compatible with the bearing of arms. The precept that exhorts the Church to abhor bloodshed has never dropped completely out of sight, and in relatively tranquil and orderly times it has always been very much to the fore. In the period between the 11th and the 14th century even Guelph writers had to recognize that side by side with papal supremacy an emperor existed as a secular sovereign who functioned as the instrument and secular arm of the Church. The most complete despotisms to which Christian peoples have ever been subject arose in Byzantium and in Russia, where the secular rulers succeeded most completely in bringing ecclesiastical authority under their direct control. The English, on the other hand, are greatly indebted for their liberties to the Puritans and to other nonconformists. 9. Next, after the separation of secular and ecclesiastical authority, the most essential requisites for a more or less advanced type of juridical defense are to be found in the way in which wealth is distributed in a society and in the way in which military forces are organized. Here again a distinction must be drawn between nations that are still in their feudal period and nations that have already developed a bureaucratic organization. In the feudal state, wealth and military power are ordinarily concentrated in the hands of the ruling class, wealth consisting largely in the ownership of land, as is uniformly the case in rudimentary stages of civilization. Even in a feudal society this state of affairs presents many drawbacks, but in a type of society it never has the effects it has in more highly perfected types of social organization. The head of a feudal state will be able to wrong any one of his barons, but he will never be absolute master of them all. They have at their disposal a certain amount of public force, if one may so speak, and will always be able to exercise de facto a right of resistance which, in bureaucratic states, once it is recognized, is written into the constitutions and the code books of public law. The individual barons, in their turn, find that there is a limit to the tyranny which they can exercise over the masses of their subjects. Unreasonableness on their part may provoke a desperate unrest which may easily become rebellion. So it turns out that in all truly feudal countries the rule of the masters may be violent and arbitrary by fits and starts, but on the whole it is considerably limited by customs. The Abyssinians, for instance, and especially the Afghans, owe only a highly qualified obedience to their races and their emirs. We have already seen, section 6, above, that traditions and other remnants of a feudal system may serve to limit the authority of the head of a state. Not even in the age of Louis XIV, or of Frederick the Great, could European monarchy be compared to the political systems that were headed by the emperors of Byzantium or the Shahs of Persia. A more or less complete separation of the temporal and spiritual powers in France and Prussia must have contributed to that result. With the exception of Russia and Turkey, there has never been a country in modern Europe in which the head of the government exercised greater personal authority than did Frederick the Great in Prussia, and his father before him. The peculiar personalities of those sovereigns, the small size of the state they administered, the special circumstances that prevailed in their day in history, combined to make their administrations the real foundation of Prussian greatness. But when the class that monopolizes wealth and arms embodies its power in a centralized bureaucracy and an irresistible standing army, we get despotism in its worst form, namely, a barbarous and primitive system of government that has the instruments of an advanced civilization at its disposal, a yoke of iron which is applied by rough and reckless hands and which is very hard to break, since it has been steeled and tempered by practiced artisans. That an omnipotent standing army makes one of the worst forms of government is a fact so well recognized that we shall not dwell upon it here. Also well known is the fact that too great a concentration of wealth in the hands of a portion of the ruling class has brought on the ruin of relatively perfect political organisms, such as the Roman Republic. Laws and institutions that guarantee justice and protect the rights of the weak cannot possibly be effective when wealth is so distributed that we get, on the one hand, a small number of persons possessing lands and mobile capital and, on the other, a multitude of proletarians who have no resource but the labor of their hands and owe it to the rich if they do not die of hunger from one day to the next. In that state of affairs to proclaim universal suffrage, or the rights of man, or the maxim that all are equal before the law, is merely ironical, and just as ironical is it to say that every man carries a marshal's baton in his knapsack, or that he is free some day to become a capitalist himself. Even granting that some few individuals do realize those high possibilities, they will not necessarily be the best individuals, either in intelligence or in morals. They may be the most persistent, the most fortunate or, perhaps, the most crooked. Meanwhile the mass of the people will still remain just as much subject to those on high. There is no use either in cherishing illusions as to the practical consequences of a system in which political power and control of economic production and distribution are irrevocably delegated to, or conferred upon, the same persons. In so far as the state absorbs and distributes a larger and larger portion of the public wealth, the leaders of the ruling class come to possess greater and greater facilities for influencing and commanding their subordinates, and more easily evade control by anybody. One of the most important reasons for the decline of the parliamentary system is the relatively huge numbers of offices, contracts for public works and other favors of an economic character which the governing class is in a position to distribute either to individuals or to groups of persons, and the drawbacks of that system are the greater in proportion as the amount of wealth that the government or local elective bodies absorb and distribute is greater, and the harder it becomes, therefore, to secure an independent position and an honest living without relying in some respect or other upon public administration. If, then, all the instruments of production pass into the hands of the government, the officials who control and apportion production become the arbiters of the fortunes and welfare of all, and we get a more powerful oligarchy, a more all-embracing racket, than has ever been seen in a society of advanced civilization. If all moral and material advantages depend on those who hold power, There is no baseness that will not be resorted to in order to please them, just as there is no act of chicanery or violence that will not be resorted to in order to attain power, in other words, in order to belong to the number of those who hand out the cake rather than to the larger number of those who have to rest content with the slices that are doled out to them. A society is best placed to develop a relatively perfect political organization when it contains a large class of people whose economic position is virtually independent of those who hold supreme power and who have sufficient means to be able to devote a portion of their time to perfecting their culture and acquiring that interest in the public weal, that aristocratic spirit, we are almost tempted to say, which alone can induce people to serve their country with no other satisfactions than those that come from individual pride and self-respect. In all countries that ever have been, or now are, in the lead as regards juridical defense, or liberty, as it is commonly called, such a class has been prominent. There was such a class in Rome, when Rome had a teeming plebs of small property owners who, the times being modest ones, managed to be self-sufficient and to win step by step, with amazing persistence, the rights of full citizenship. There was such a class in England in the 17th century, and there is one there now. England's numerous gentry, which was made up in those days chiefly of moderately rich landowners and is now chiefly made up of moderately rich businessmen, is now supplying, as it then supplied, the best elements to the ruling class. There has been and there still is such a class in the United States of America, and such a class has existed in most of the countries of Central and Western Europe. Where the class is inadequate to its task because of deficiencies in cultivation or in education or in wealth, parliamentary government bears its worst fruits, as would any other political system. 10. As civilization grows, the number of the moral and material influences which are capable of becoming social forces increases. For example, property and money, as the fruit of industry and commerce, comes into being alongside of real property. Education progresses. Occupations based on scientific knowledge gain in importance. So a new social class forms which, up to a certain point, counterbalances the material prestige of the rich and the moral prestige of the clergy. Not only that. Mutual toleration results from advanced culture, and toleration enables different religions and different political currents to exist side by side, balancing and checking one another. Specialization of public functions enables many different influences to express themselves in government and to participate in the control of the state. At the same time, public discussion of the acts of the rulers becomes possible. Freedom of the press, so-called, is a very recent instrument of juridical defense. It was not established in England till the end of the 17th century, and not till the 19th century did it make its way into the constitutional and parliamentary countries of continental Europe. And yet, in order to gain an influence proportionate to its real importance, every political force has to be organized, and before it can be well organized, a number of factors, important among them time and tradition, are indispensable. That is why, in one country or another at one time or another, we see an actual disproportion between the importance that a class has acquired in society and the direct influence it exerts in the government of the country. One thinks at once of the French bourgeoisie before 1789, or of the English middle classes before 1892. There is almost always some one political force, furthermore, that manifests an invincible tendency to overreach or absorb the others, and so to destroy a juridical equilibrium that has gradually been established. That is true both of political forces of a material character, such as wealth and military power, and of forces of a moral character, such as the great currents of religion or thought. Each of such currents claims to monopolize truth and justice, and all types of exclusivism and bigotry, whether Christian or Mohammedan, whether sacred or rationalistic, whether inspired by the infallibility of the Pope or by the infallibility of democracy, are equally pernicious from this point of view. Every country, every epoch, has its own peculiar current of ideas and beliefs, which being the strongest current, bears down upon the political mechanism and tends to subvert it. Quite generally the harm that has been done by weakening currents, which are going, or have gone, out of fashion, is appreciated very well, and the deep wounds that they have inflicted on the sense of justice are stigmatized with horror. Meantime the similar harm that the current in rising vogue has done, or is threatening to do, is not discerned or else is condoned or, at the most, feebly viewed with alarm. Men cry aloud and proclaim that liberty has been won, that the storm is over. Actually the storm has merely changed direction, or, if one may use the metaphor, merely changed shape and color. A number of moral forces have long striven to upset the juridical equilibrium in Europe: the Church, social democracy, nationalism. In spite of its strong organization, the Church may be considered the least violent and menacing of them all, and it will continue to be so unless danger of proletarian revolution forces the upper classes to turn again to religious beliefs which they have now abandoned or profess but tepidly. Among material forces, a force that is able very easily to override all the powers of the state and sometimes to violate, let alone the norms of justice and equity, the literal text of the law, is mobile wealth. It is money, or at least that portion of money which is powerfully organized. The great development of banking systems and of credit, the growth of large corporations, which often control the communication systems of vast territories and entire states, the great enlargement of public debts, have in the last 100 years created new structures, new elements of political importance, so that some of the greatest states in the Old World and the New have already had occasion to learn from experience how overbearing and how all-pervasive their influence can be. The relative ease with which money, or mobile wealth, can be organized and the possibility of concentrating control of large amounts of money in the hands of a few individuals help to explain its growing preponderance in power. In this phenomenon we have one of the many examples of an organized minority prevailing over a disorganized majority. A very small number of individuals can control all the banks of issue in a country or all the companies engaged in transportation by land or sea. They can own and control great stock companies and industrial corporations which deal in commodities that are indispensable to national defense, such as iron and steel. They can carry out public works for which not even the finances of the richest governments would be adequate. With hundreds of millions at their disposal, such individuals possess the most varied resources for threatening or cajoling other interests however far-reaching, and for intimidating and corrupting public officials, ministries, legislative bodies, newspapers. Meantime, that portion, and undoubtedly it is the larger portion, of the national capital which is invested in the hosts and hosts of small or medium-sized industries, or scattered about in many hands in the form of savings in amounts more or less large, has no power whatever to react. Be it noted that the far larger part of the capital of banks and industrial corporations usually belongs to small and medium-sized stockholders, who not only remain completely passive but are often the first victims of their leaders, who succeed in founding great fortunes and building up powerful public influence on the losses they inflict on others. It is difficult at the present time for real property to find the same facilities for asserting itself that money finds. Though landed property may not be very much divided, it is always divided enough to make it difficult in a large country for a small number of large landowners working in coalition to dictate to a market, or to force their will upon a government. So true is this that industrial protectionism appeared in advance of agrarian protectionism. The latter came about as a reaction to the former and as a sort of indirect compensation for the consequences of the former. A temporary monopoly may be acquired by the proprietors of lands immediately adjoining large cities that are undergoing rapid development in real estate. In such cases the same forms of corruption as are characteristic of the influence of money arise. 11. When a system of political organization is based upon a single absolute principle, so that the whole political class is organized after a single pattern, it is difficult for all social forces to participate in public life, and more difficult still for any one force to counterbalance another. That is as true when power is in the hands of elected officials who are said to be chosen by the people as it is when power is entrusted exclusively to employees who are assumed to be appointed by a prince. The checks which bureaucracy and democracy can enforce upon themselves and which are applied through the agency of other bureaucrats or elected officials are always inadequate. In practice they never wholly achieve their purposes. The administrative history of the Roman Empire furnishes a pertinent instance of the incapacity of a centralized bureaucracy to curb itself effectively. In the beginning, both in the capital and in the municipalities, both in the colonies and in the provincial cities, there was, under the supremacy of republican or imperial Rome, what the English call self-government, that is to say, public offices were filled without salaries by a large class of well-to-do people. Right beginning with the establishment of the empire, functions in the city of Rome which until then had been delegated to aediles and censors were turned over to special salaried functionaries, and these were assisted in their work by a large personnel of employees, who also received compensation. Superintendence of the provisioning of the city was entrusted to a praefectus anani, public works to curators viarum, aquarum, operum publicorum, reparum et alvae tiberis, surveillance over lighting and fires to a praefectus vigilum and police functions to a praefectus urbis. The system that had been introduced in the capital very soon spread to the municipalities, which one by one lost their administrative autonomy. Down to AD 80 electoral campaigning for the posts of Duumvir and Aedile was still very keen in some municipalities. Not a few Pompeian frescoes show candidates being recommended and eulogized. But as early as the end of the first century of the empire, a considerable diminution takes place in the authority of the Duumviri juris diundo and the aediles, to whom local administration of the individual cities had been entrusted, these officials being gradually replaced by employees of the empire juridici, correctors, curators rerum publicarum. Slow as the evolution may have been, by the time of Nerva and Trajan elected functionaries were periodically suspended from their posts and their duties were entrusted for specified periods to curators, something like the Italian royal commissioners, regi commissari, of the present day. At the same time there was a slow growth in the inspectorial authority and directive jurisdiction of the corrector provincial, in this case something equivalent to the modern French or Italian prefect. Finally, at the end of the 2nd century, municipal autonomy was extinct almost everywhere, and a gigantic all-embracing bureaucratic network extended over the whole empire. At the same time the well-to-do municipal bourgeoisie declined. That class made up the ordo decurianum and participated in the government of the cities. The men who held the posts of duumvir and aedile were selected from it. The office of the curialis involved a heavy financial responsibility, since the class of curiales as a whole gave bond for the payment of the whole tax laid upon a given city. This burden contributed beyond a doubt to the economic ruin of the Roman middle class. Now when fiscalism and bureaucratic centralization had created the Roman society of the Low Empire, a society made up of a very small class of large property owners and high officials and another very populous class of wretchedly poor people, who had no social importance whatever and, though freeborn, readily sank to the status of tenants, we witness the appearance of a very original institution, a new bureaucratic organ that was designed to safeguard the interests of the needy classes, and of such remnants of the small landowners as survived, and protect them from abuse by the bureaucracy. The office of Defensor Civitatis was created by Valentinian I in the year 364. This public defender was just an employee appointed expressly to shelter the urban plebs from the tyranny of high officials, or of the rich who made common cause with the high officials. His particular function was to see to it that the complaints of the poor were admitted to trial in accordance with the law and that their appeals reached the foot of the throne. But, in spite of the best of intentions on the part of the legislator, this effort of bureaucratic absolutism to correct and control itself can have had no very appreciable effects. The old abuses continued, and the forces that were leading the empire to its destruction continued to operate with the same potency. The method chosen to cure the evils was not the aptest imaginable. A high official is very likely to have the points of view, the passions, the prejudices, of the class to which he belongs, and his sentiments, as well as his interests, will incline him to deport himself in such a way as to win the approval of his own class rather than the approval of another class to which he feels morally and intellectually alien and in which he may already have learned to abuse and despise. Bureaucratic absolutism in Russia had its most ancient roots in the influence of Byzantium, which made itself felt at Kiev from the time of Vladimir the Great and his successors. It was certainly reinforced by the terrible Mongol domination, which supervened in the 13th century and was to weigh upon the country down into the 16th. In Russia again, the famous secret chancellery that was organized by the Tsar Alexis toward the middle of the 17th century was nothing more than a special police force that tapered directly upward to the sovereign and was designed to keep an eye on abuses, but also on attempts at revolt, among the high officials and the boyars who constituted, when all was said and done, a single class. Now the third section, so deplorably famous under the last Tsars, stemmed in a direct and legitimate line from this secret chancellery of Alexis. There were periods of calm and periods of recrudescence in the activity of the third section. Many times abolished in name, it was always retained in fact, and it appears that actually, far from eradicating venality and corruption from the Russian bureaucracy, it served to intensify the oppression that the bureaucracy inflicted on the rest of the country. In the United States, on the other hand, one sees the inability of a democracy to control and limit itself. It cannot be denied that the framers of the Constitution of 1787 took great care to embody the principle of checks and balances in that document in order to achieve a perfect equilibrium between the various powers and the various political organs. Given the thoroughly democratic basis of the government, the absolute lack of any power that does not emanate directly from popular suffrage, it is hard to believe that anything better could have been imagined. The Senate, to begin with, has greater and more real powers than the upper houses in Europe usually have. It actually participates in the exercise of executive power, and, expressing a still lively sense of the independence of the separate states, it enjoys great public prestige. But then again the president has a veto power, and he uses it freely. He cannot be compelled to resign by a vote of the lower house. He concentrates all governmental responsibility in his own person for a period of 4 years. As an organ of juridical defense, the American presidency is far superior to the cabinets in the parliamentary countries of Europe, since European cabinets have less authority than the American president and more need of kowtowing to assemblymen and politicians than he. Since they are collective bodies, their members never feel the pressure of personal responsibility which the American president feeds. To this breadth of powers, and to the feeling of personal responsibility that often develops with tenure in high office, is due the fact that during the last century a number of presidents, for example Johnson, Hayes, and Cleveland, have stood out with stubbornness and courage against the worst excesses of the parties that elected them. Johnson, 1865 to 1869, came to the presidency on the death of Lincoln. He steadfastly opposed handing over the defeated South to pillaging by the petty Republican politicians who came to be known as carpetbaggers. Hayes was also a Republican. Though he had come into power through a questionable juggling of votes, which was upheld by a decision of the Supreme Court, he at once put an end to the reign of plunder and terror that had continued for 8 years in the Democratic states of the South during the double term of the greatly overestimated Grant. Cleveland, a Democratic president elected in 1884, among other highly meritorious acts, had the courage to retain in office a number of Republican officials whom his partisans wished to have dismissed, a high-minded effort to abolish the Jacksonian system whereby the party that was victorious at the polls took over all remunerative posts. As governor of New York State, Cleveland had become famous through a successful fight with the Tweed ring that was bossing the aldermanic chamber of New York City. But this, so to say, formal perfection of mechanism in federal and state governments has only to an extent made up for a defect which is fundamental in the whole political and administrative system of the American Union, and that defect has been greatly aggravated by a tendency which began to manifest itself between 1820 and 1850 and has now become virtually countrywide. We refer to the fact that suffrage has been made equal and universal in almost all the American states. In the early days of the Union, the right to vote was generally subject to a man's status as a taxpayer. Indeed, in early days, in the New England states, a Puritan system prevailed whereby the right to vote was conferred on members of religious congregations. Then the property qualification was introduced in those states as well. High property qualifications were also required for eligibility for election to local state legislatures and to the governorship. Equal suffrage began to be introduced in the early 19th century in the western states, where everybody was a recent immigrant and a landowner. Then it was adopted for all whites in the southern states, and finally it was extended to the state of New York and to New England. This evolution was completed around 1850, under the influence of new immigrants and French democratic ideas. Negroes, as is well known, did not receive the vote until 1865. Simultaneously with the broadening of suffrage came the growth in vogue of the principles of direct election and limited tenure for judges. Again, the old states of New England held out longest against this current, but they too were carried away by it in the end. As a result of this movement, a single class of electors now casts its votes in all elections. Judges in the various states were once appointed for life, and the appointments were made by the respective governors. The office of judge has now become directly elective and temporary. In this way, the same electoral clique invariably chooses federal and local authorities. Governors, judges and congressmen are in the last analysis instruments of the same influences, which become the absolute and irresponsible masters of a whole country, all the more since the American politicians make a business of elections and are highly skilled in the art of manufacturing machines and rings. Under this system, in other words, all the powers that should balance and supplement each other emanate from a single caucus or electoral committee. But, it might be objected, under a system of universal suffrage all political forces and influences can be represented in the governing class in proportion to their numerical importance, and it therefore becomes impossible for a minority to monopolize power in the state to its own advantage and so to make the state an instrument of its own views and passions. This objection reflects a theory that is still much in vogue but which we have not been accepting and in fact have been indirectly combating all along in these pages. We had better stop, therefore, and deal with it directly.